This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand, and what a massive week it has been in the news. Obviously some very concerning anti-Semitic attacks in both Melbourne and Sydney. The Prime Minister seems to be in crisis. Certainly he is under attack. He himself appears to have attacked the media, which is never a good move or a good sign if you are the Prime Minister. What is going on? We are going to untangle this massive mess that we find ourselves in and see if we can make sense of it all. I've got an incredibly insightful master of the dark arts, a political strategist, spin doctor extraordinaire who has worked for 3 prime ministers and Labor leaders, as well as a whole host of premiers, worked on a whole bunch of election campaigns, doing black ops and all the messaging, and he knows how this is done. He's going to explain what the Prime Minister was thinking, why it took him so long to get to the synagogue, how he can manage himself out of the crisis in which he finds himself, and whether or not he'll go on to win the election next year. We're going to have absolutely everything you need to know, as we do every week, right here on The Real Story. Don't go anywhere. So obviously this week we just have to talk about the story that's been dominating the news, not just this week, but basically for more than a year now, ever since the October 7 terror attacks that have sparked this massive conflict in the Middle East that has been absolutely tragic for all sides. But it has resulted here in Australia in the most disturbing wave of anti-Semitism, I think, I have ever seen in my lifetime, and I know a lot of people in the Jewish community say is completely unprecedented here. And I just wanted to sort of unpack why Jewish people are feeling the way they're feeling. I'm not Jewish, despite what everyone thinks. I'm a good Catholic boy. Actually, that's not true. I'm a very bad Catholic boy. I haven't been to Mass for months, but I'm going to get back there. I work every Sunday. It's very unchristian. But I have a lot of Jewish friends. I know a lot of people in the Jewish community. I've been to Israel, been to Jerusalem. I have been accused of being Jewish myself by neo-Nazis and had my face and name and detailed spread on the dark web with people saying we should go out and get this guy because he's a dirty Jew and he doesn't like neo-Nazis. Just a quick FYI, guys, a lot of people don't like neo-Nazis. It's not just the Jews. It's just the Jews that you don't like. Okay, but anyway. And that's kind of the point, because there is a tendency, I think, to see anti-Semitism as not as important or not as bad as other forms of racism or prejudice. And that seems to me pretty passing strange, because anti-Semitism is unique among prejudices in terms of the sheer industrial scale and the sheer extremity of hatred and destruction that it has spawned. Now, this culminated obviously with the Nazis during World War II and the greatest ever genocide in human history. At least 6 million people exterminated as though they were animals, exterminated as though they were not human. That is really important, because that is how the Nazis categorized Jews. That is how they presented them, as being not human, less than human, like beasts, like animals, like vermin. It's all part of a deliberate strategy to completely dehumanize them, rob them of their dignity, and therefore rob them of their right to even exist. But that's not new. That didn't come out of nowhere. In Russia, under the Tsar, under the communists, there would also be pogroms. Jewish people would be attacked. Christians were probably the worst persecutors of all throughout history. In the Middle Ages, in the Tudor era, Jews were rounded up and deported. They were kicked out of England altogether, just booted out, say, get out of here. Where do they go? They don't have any other country to go to. They've got no home to go to. It's not even like a refugee coming here and we say, no, you've got to go back to where you came from. They didn't have anywhere they were from except for Israel, except for Jerusalem, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And so these are people who have been stateless for 2,000 years, since the 1st century AD until the establishment of Israel after World War II, after the Holocaust, after that genocide. And again, this is something that has happened again and again and again throughout history. And yes, there have been other genocides that have been absolutely appalling. There have been wars over land and resources. There have been ideological wars, religious wars. We had the Crusades go and try to wipe out Muslim populations or conquer Muslim populations in the Middle East. But of course, that came after, the huge armies of Muhammad came and swept through the Middle East and conquered whole swathes of what was then Asia Minor and Northern Africa. And of course, Christians had to run away back then. That's what happens in history. It goes back and forth. You have great invading armies. The Mongols, they invaded a lot of places as well, displaced a lot of people, built mountains of skulls. Again, a lot of bad things have happened to a lot of people throughout history. And yet, it's only really been the Jews who have never had any home to go to since the Romans crushed Jerusalem and sent them scattered to the four winds in the 1st century AD. They've got nowhere else to go, and everywhere they go, they end up being run out of town. Again, Christians were the worst offenders, but also Muslims often. Sometimes people would tolerate them for a while, and then inevitably there'd be some kind of conspiracy that would come up. There'd be a conspiracy about just crazy stuff, nutty stuff, that they kill babies, blood libel, and again, it still goes on today with the Rothschild conspiracy. I don't even know what that means. But the stuff that the Nazis use, of course, there's this secret society, secret world order that they're planning to take over the world. Just absolute nutty stuff. This simply does not apply to any other race or religion or ethnicity. You just do not have that constant thread of sheer crazed hatred towards a particular people of the same kind of consistency that you do with the Jews over the millennia. And yes, the Nazis were the worst, but they were not the first. And that is how we have to understand what Jews in Australia are feeling right now. You have to understand what they have gone through, not just over the last year, not just with a firebombed synagogue or a firebombed house or a firebombed car, but through centuries and centuries and centuries, millennia of being targeted, abused, exterminated, killed if they didn't convert to Christianity, booted out of the country sometimes either way. These people have spent their entire life, they are defined by other people wanting to harm them, wanting to exterminate or expel them. And there are people in Australia, people I've spoken to, whose parents and grandparents would have told them the stories of the Holocaust, would have told them the stories of the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich and Nazi Germany. The smashing of shop windows, the firebombing of Jewish places. This is exactly what happened in Kristallnacht. This is what happened on the night of the broken glass that presaged the greatest ever genocide the world has ever seen. It looked exactly like the sort of stuff we are starting to see in Australia right now. And you have a community of people whose grandparents will be telling them, I've seen this before. This happened before. And this is what happened next. And so when people say, oh, what about Islamophobia? Or what about other racism? Or what about this or that? When we're talking about the rise of these kinds of actions in Australia in the 21st century that are a little microcosm of what happened in 1930s Germany. I'm sorry, it's just not the same thing. You are just simply not understanding the nature of the problem and not understanding the nature of the fear. And that is why one of the first things that happened when the synagogue was attacked in the early hours of last Friday, that is why there were instantly demands from the whole Jewish community for the Prime Minister to call this an act of terror. And this was one of the great kind of, I suppose, confusions and great kind of mismatches in understanding. And I think it's been resolved now. But, of course, the Prime Minister has no power to call something an act of terror under the law. He can't sort of simply decide, oh, this was a terrorist act. It has to be investigated. ASIO or the AFP have to see what the motivations were, what the person or persons were trying to achieve. Then they determine whether or not that's an act of terror, and then it gets investigated and prosecuted accordingly. The Prime Minister has no power to do that. But that is not what the Jewish community was talking about. What the Jewish community was talking about, what they wanted from the PM, was not to say this is technically an act of terror under the law. They didn't want him to tick a box. What they wanted him to understand was that we are terrified. This was done to make us terrified. This was done to instill terror in us, and you must understand that, and you must call it that. And I think the Prime Minister has done so. I think he is and now has finally understood the gravity of the situation, the fact that we have had another anti-Semitic attack in Sydney just days afterwards, I think really drives that point home and underscores the point that for all the injustices in the world, for all the prejudices in the world, there is something incredibly specific and incredibly insidious about anti-Jew hatred. And I think we're finally starting to get that now. And it's a bloody good thing too, because if we do not get it now, it may soon be too late. Amid all this, obviously, the PM is feeling a huge amount of pressure. It's been a really difficult year for him. He's got some things wrong, fair enough. He's got some things right, but no one's noticing that because everyone's struggling. And I refer to the first point, he got some things wrong. And so it's natural in these situations to want to kind of lash out, blame others, or at least, tell people that things aren't as bad as they seem. And that is totally fair enough. And it is a completely human response. But sometimes that can result in, how can I put this, making the problem 1,000 times worse. And this is what has inadvertently happened with the leak of comments that the PM made to Cabinet about how News Corp, the company that I work for, is out to get him. Now, as I say, I work for News Corp. I work for lots of different arms of News Corp. I clearly am very fond of Anthony Albanese, and others who work for News Corp are clearly not very fond of Anthony Albanese. And I know that we can be a very tough crowd, and I know that News Corp often goes hard, and the Daily Telegraph is a ripper little paper, but it's a tough crowd. It's not easily pleased. And chances are it will tell you 100 things that the government has done wrong before it tells you one thing that the government's done right. I know that there was someone who wrote in to one of my columns years and years ago, said that I know the Telegraph is doing its job right when I feel like everything that's wrong in my life is the fault of the New South Wales government, even though I live in Queensland. And I thought that is actually bang on. That is it. So again, the telly is, it's a bit like I tell politicians, it's a bit like Will Smith in Independence Day, where he shoots down the flying saucer with his fighter jet, and then he goes to open the canopy of the flying saucer, and this horrible green alien with tentacles goes, and Will Smith just goes, he's sort of taken aback a bit, and then he just goes, punches it right in the head. And he says, "Welcome to Earth." He doesn't talk like that. That sounded like Donald Trump punching the alien in the head. But anyway, that's kind of what the Daily Telegraph does with all new leaders. We just give them a hard time. We see what they're made of. We go round for round in the ring just to see who they are, what they do, how they respond to things. And then we think, all right, if you're still standing, maybe you're all right. But again, I'm going to be fair to the PM. I know that News Corp, can give him a hard time. That is what the media does. That is what the press should do. They should hold leaders to account, but leaders are also human, and sometimes when they feel it all gets too much, they think, hey, it's just not fair. But in politics, life is not fair. And as Winston Churchill said, a politician complaining about the press is like a sailor complaining about the sea. In other words, if you can't handle the press, you shouldn't be a politician. If you can't handle the sea, you shouldn't be a sailor. And I don't think that the PM was actually genuinely trying to sort of have a whinge or blame all this up. I think he was going to Cabinet Cabinet is meant to be a place of pretty intense solidarity and a place where things do not leak. Now, you get leaks from caucus all the time, which is the entire party room. Every Labor MP in the parliament makes up the caucus, and that leaks like a sieve, quite frankly. It's a great party tradition to leak from caucus. And oftentimes you will want what is said in caucus leaked. Like the PM was really strong and he addressed this issue or this and that. Some MPs raise concerns and that will be leaked so that their electorates know that they're, arguing against government policy privately, even if they can't publicly, that sort of stuff. But Cabinet is not meant to leak. Cabinet solidarity is incredibly important. It is meant to, the Cabinet meets, they take a decision. It is meant to be a vault. No one else is meant to know what is said in there. And then Cabinet goes and takes a unified position, even if it's, 11 to 10 in the Cabinet, all 21 or whatever it is at any given point in time, takes a unified position of caucus. That caucus then leaks like a sieve about whatever it is they want to leak about, but then they go and take a unified position to the parliament. That's on the Labor side, Lib side, a bit different. But anyway, so the PM has gone in. He's had a shocker of a past couple of weeks, it's fair to say, or in a rough kind of year. And he's saying, look, it's not as bad as you think, guys. They're just, they're just out to get me. I can't cut a break. They're just going hard, right? And fair enough if he thinks that. And fair enough if he wants to just express that frustration to people who are meant to keep it literally in the room. It's literally not meant to leave the room. And again, he needs to present to his team as someone who is actually doing a good job, someone who is actually leading them to victory at the next election, not someone who is stuffing everything up. And so, of course, you can say, look, it's not as bad as you think. It's just that they keep coming at me. But what has happened? Well, obviously, it has leaked from the Cabinet, which is a big move. If someone finds out you've leaked from Cabinet, you're not in the Cabinet anymore. You are no longer a minister if you're identified as a leak and the PM didn't want you to. And according to the 9 newspapers, strangely enough, it wasn't leaked to News Corp. It's leaked to the other line. But according to the reports, there were 4 sources, 4 ministers who leaked what went on. Now, some of them might have been actually saying, oh, no, Albo didn't say that like that, didn't say it in that way. There were people who said, you shouldn't be whinging like this. This is a really bad look. And there were people who said, oh, but he wasn't saying it in a sort of sooky, la-la kind of way. He was saying it in just a matter-of-fact way. But again, the fact that this leaked at all indicates that there were a couple of people in that room who thought that this was a really bad idea and indeed possibly thought it was such a bad idea that they needed to make sure that it got out there just so everyone could realise what a bad idea that it was. And I think that is pretty quickly happening now because I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said you should never pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the barrel. And again, if you are saying to people, I'm actually doing a really good job, but the press is just out to get me and the media is just making it look bad and there's nothing I can do about that, it's not my fault, then why are you there? If you're a leader, if you're the Prime Minister, you are there because you're able to overcome these things, because you're able to build relationships with the press or you're able to produce stories, produce policies that people can't punch a hole in. That must be great because, of course, not a single media organisation in the country is ever going to criticise a policy that it thinks is going to be great for its readers or its viewers or its listeners. And so, criticising the press, even when it's warranted, is a bit like shooting the messenger. You're just not cutting through to the people on the other side. If you're a politician, if you're a leader, you should be able to do that. You should be able to get to the people on the other side. And it's interesting, and I do not think for a second that Albo is actually heading this way, but it is interesting that it is 2 former prime ministers who were both rolled by their own colleagues who really, really, really did not like them, who ended up after that event blaming Rupert Murdoch for all of it. So this was, of course, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, who chaired the Australians for a Royal Commission into the Murdoch news media, whatever that means. And again, these were people who were knifed in the back by those closest to them, not Rupert Murdoch. So I guess what I'm saying is, and, again, I work for Murdoch News Corp. Every angle, every arm of News Corporation that I can find, I work for. I love it. But again, blaming them for something that your own friends and colleagues did to you shows that you are not completely in control of your own destiny. And that would just be my little helpful piece of advice to all politicians, wherever they may be, who happen to be listening to this very important public service announcement. Well, it's fair to say that 2024 hasn't been the best year for the Albanese Labor government. And, they've been around for 3 years, so 2 out of 3 ain't bad. But we thought we'd give them a bit of a leg up this week. And so I've brought in the big guns. This guy is the master of the dark arts. He is a political strategist extraordinaire. He is so feared by the opposition that they call him the agent of infection. And he joins me this week. Eamonn Fitzpatrick, welcome to The Real Story. How are you?
Thank you, Joe. Always good to be with you. You know that.
Always a pleasure to have you, my friend. Now, you have worked for, I think, the last 3 Labor leaders, or 4 if you count Kevin Rudd twice. You've run state elections right around the country, federal elections for years. And you really were given that moniker, the agent of infection, because the Queensland LNP was so scared whenever you came to work on a campaign. They try to say, it's not fair. They're getting people from outside Queensland to come and help them. And they knew that you would come in and win. And indeed you did, time and time and time again. The government, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just crazy. But Albo seems to be having a bit of a rough ride at the moment.
Yeah, look, times are tough. There's no doubt about that, Joe. But you know what? Politics is tough, full stop. I mean, I've had days turn into months, into years where you are on this roller coaster. There's only some things you can sort of steer, and there's some things which just get away from you. Things you will never see coming will just come up. And so the test is, how quickly can you get onto that? How quickly can you manage it, respond, move on? And how quickly do you launch a counter-offensive, And that's the issue. Now, Anthony he's the PM. He has, when you actually look at his government's record, they've done some pretty amazing things. So you talk about all the budget stuff, right? 10 years of deficits. Guess what? These guys, 2 surpluses in a row. I mean,
that's amazing. That was incredible luck, because they changed the way that they account. And again, you take the good luck in politics and you take credit for it. But of course, when the bad luck happens, which are also factors beyond your control, then people are going to blame you even when it's not your fault. Is that kind of what's happening here? They're riding this wave and suddenly the weather's changed?
That's exactly right. And the problem is people stop listening to all the good stuff. They're not, they stop listening when you're trying to tell them, new jobs came in under this government, where inflation began, with a 6 and it's slowly trending down, and, a rate cut cannot come soon enough. So the problem is distraction, we're all so busy. Yeah. We are all so busy. People have the capacity, if you're lucky, for one message of the day, if you are lucky these days. And it's so heavily contested. Back in the day, we'd wake up, go through all the papers, have a laugh, have breakfast. Who does that? Literally.
Well, everyone's struggling to make a quid, isn't it? I know I'm working like a dog. I'm worried about the mortgage. I'm pretty well off compared to most people, so I can only imagine. Well, I don't have to imagine, because people tell me all the time. They say, I'm up against it. I'm up against the wall. And again, you rattle off all those things that the government is doing, but it doesn't feel like it to those people, because even if it's helping them a bit, they're still not as well off as they were a year ago, 2 years ago.
Look, 100%. So I travel a lot and work a lot in the region. I'm in countries where, and most of them are doing this, lifting large numbers of people out of poverty. Yeah. In Australia, the challenge is to keep this incredibly high standard of living. And, things start to... people have a very, very sort of set view about whether something has been an issue or it hasn't. My favorite example is the global financial crisis. The truth is, we did not feel that here. We did not, and so it's almost as if maybe it didn't quite happen that way, but you look at countries around the world. And so I think people see it through the sort of the Oz filter. Life is good, and people rightfully expect to continue their high standard of living because you do work hard here and all of those sorts of things. So I think that's part of the challenge too, is this is one of the few countries where the standard of living is so good here that actually the political challenge is how you keep improving that. And, that in itself is going to cause a problem. Expectations are high.
And again, well, I suppose we came off something like 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth under Hawke, Keating, Coward and Costello. So anything's going to be rocky, I suppose, compared to that. We talked about sort of, circumstances beyond control. 90% of leadership is crisis management. That's 90% of the job of being PM. Is it a mistake, to own those good turns of fortune? Again, when, the government was so lucky, they say, kicked in the arse by a rainbow, as they say, to get this budget surplus, thanks to strong iron ore, thanks to this new way of calculating the budget, which was due to come in under the coalition. So totally fair play. Nothing the Labor did that was fiddly, but it was just really good luck, and they completely owned it, as they would. They blamed the Morrison government for the rising inflation and the rising cost of living, and then when it kept going up, suddenly it's kind of beyond their control. How you deal with messaging, you deal with how you sell these things. How risky is it to claim credit for things that you didn't really do, because you then get saddled with all the baggage of bad things that you also aren't responsible for?
Yeah, it is always a risk. And I think what's been interesting, so here in New South Wales, you look at Chris Minns. Yep. He is very much a new generation leader, right? And he has not been shy about giving his predecessors credit. You look at the Metro, he was pretty generous about that, actually. Yep. And he
invited all three premiers who presided over the construction of the Metro to ride on the inaugural train, and people loved him for that.
Well, and
he
he's
pretended
really,
it was all him.
You got it, and it's like he's very much a new generation leader, who has really found his sort of pace, and he's moving through, and people really respond to that because he's seemed to do that. They sort of think, well, he's a fair income sort of guy, right? But that's because what's contested in New South Wales, I think the playing field's changed here a lot. Whereas I think you look at federal politics, and that is still a little bit more old school. It's still, there's increasing, the margins are bleeding left, right, and center. There's more independence coming into, there's more of a fracturing of views, but it's still, I think it still very much is this very old school sort of.
And this is where I think, and tell me if you agree, this is where I think Albo is struggling, because he played a really small target strategy during the election campaign, which was the smart tactical thing to do. And then he came into office. He had a lot of good luck. His signature, the thing that most people loved about him was him breaking the promise about the stage 3 tax cuts and instead giving a tax cut to everybody. So that was fantastic. But it was kind of him flipping someone else's policy. It wasn't something he rode in on a white charger during the election campaign saying, this is what I'm going to do for Australia. And as a result of all that, he seems to be defined by external forces. He hasn't really staked out, this is who I am, this is what I believe in, this is what I stand for, this is what my values are. Instead, he's someone who is sort of the left originally. He is very much and sincerely trying to be a prime minister of the centre. But I think a lot of people sort of think, well, he's a nice guy, but who is he? What does he really stand for? What are his values? And I think that is part of the reason why he's been so battered by the anti-Semitism stuff, because people are kind of going, well, hang on a minute, you say all these things, you say all the right things, you mouth all the platitudes, but I don't really know where you stand on Israel. I don't know where you really stand on these kind of issues. How much of a problem is that, do you think?
Well, it can be a problem, but let me also say this, Joe. So almost every leader I've worked for is made in the job, and we don't give that enough acknowledgement. And we're not just talking about Labor people. You look at John Howard. People forget his first term was a little bit all over the place.
Yes,
it was, they had all sorts of things going on.
Yeah.
Yet people look back and they see him as a very definitive, strong leader who said what he was going to do. But it took him a long time to get there. Let's be honest about that. He also had an incredibly long career. The Prime Minister's, challenge, I think, is he also has had a very long career. I've worked alongside him. I was lucky, doing, some of the parliamentary tactics when he was the leader of the House. This guy, he did that job in very difficult circumstances. He's a very astute negotiator as well, and he did a lot of good things for infrastructure in this country. So he actually does have a track record. You can do a million things, just like Julia Gillard, who went from Deputy Prime Minister to the top job, and Kevin Rudd into the top job. You only made a leader when you get into the job. And sometimes it takes a little while. Yeah. And we are very impatient.
we are very impatient. The 21st century, instant gratification. I'm glad you mentioned John Howard, because that is something I bring up all the time. And one of my favourite political sort of mantras is about John Howard. And it was said of John Howard that he made every single mistake in the book.
Yep.
But he only ever made it once.
Yep.
In other words, he made lots of mistakes, but he didn't make the same. He learned from each of them and he didn't repeat them. I have been saying the same of Anthony Albanese. I'm not sure if I'm just sort of biased, naive, but do you think he is learning from all his mistakes? Do you think he's, is he learning from his mistakes, or is he, as some people say, just too slow to act, too slow to react, not getting ahead of problems as they sort of bubble up?
Well, look, I mean, it's always a judgment call as to when is the right time. You've got to remember too, as Prime Minister, you attract an awful lot of attention. Yeah. So, it may be that people might not need you around at a particular moment either, straight away. They might want you to come later. So you're making judgment calls the whole time. When I worked for Julia Gillard, we'd turn up places. It was always, do we go now? Do we hang off a little bit, let things happen, and not turn it into a
the classic
sideshow?
thing is like a bushfire or a flood or something. The politician rocks up too soon. It's, they're trying to make capital out of it. They're getting in the way of emergency workers, trying to make it like they're the big, strong leader in a natural disaster. But if they take too long, it's like missing in action. Where are you? Might as well be in Hawaii.
There you go. And, who knows, what's been happening in the last few days. But, it is a very tumultuous time. You've got to be very considered around some things, because it's quite an inflammatory situation if you think about it. And now I've had a second attack and all this sort of stuff. Plus, he is having to, as a leader, you make judgments against what your opponents are saying. And they've been particularly inflammatory. You look at some of the things yesterday were happening, not standing by a flag. I mean, what?
Just on that, so you made reference, obviously, to the suspected firebombing of a synagogue. I mean, let's face it, the synagogue was firebombed, but there's a legal process underway. Now in Sydney, that was in Melbourne. In Sydney, of course, there's been an attack overnight on Tuesday to Wednesday of an attack in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, very high Jewish population, just ugly, ugly stuff. That follows another attack a few weeks ago. On the synagogue in particular, the PM was criticised for staying in WA for a few days, having a game of tennis on Saturday afternoon. If you work in crisis management, if you were advising him, and again, you don't want to be too hard, he's a human being, and it's good you need to exercise for your mental health. But if you're advising him, would you have said, as soon as the news came through on that Friday morning, there's been an attack on a synagogue in Melbourne, I think you should get on a plane and be there?
Look, it's in hindsight, it's easier to make judgments. But what we don't know is what was going on in his day. I mean, from what he said, he was committed to half a dozen things already. Yep. It would have been incredibly challenging, and no doubt would have disappointed a whole bunch of other people who were waiting for him, including another Jewish community event, which is my understanding. So, it's in hindsight, you should have done this and you should have done that. You don't know who's told what and when. That's the other thing. Sometimes that information chain can take a while. Working in this business, people who work for you and around you, whether in departments or offices, people are making judgments who needs to know what and when. I'm sure they would have told him. But the point is, his schedule is locked in so far in advance that there's very little room to sort of move around, really. And so was he exercising after a very, very full, long day? Yep. Has he had a day off? Not lately. But, having said, that's a separate thing. That is not unreasonable. It's the optics you start to, have to be concerned about.
And again, you don't want to be sort of too unkind with the constant comparison. But again, you can't help but think of Chris Minns, who was going on a holiday with his family overseas, touches down. As soon as the phone comes on, he realises there's a crisis back home. He says to the family, off you go, sorry, and he takes the next plane back. People, whether that made a huge amount of difference or not, you can sort of debate. You've got to feel sorry for his family. You've got to feel sorry for him. But that gesture and the fact that people know about that just makes people think, this is the guy. This is this is the guy who can handle a crisis just because he made that snap call. A lot of people are saying, another one of my favourite quotes is Winston Churchill says about the Americans, they'll always do the right thing once they've tried everything else. Albo, I think, is doing the right thing. He's doing the right thing, I think, appointing the anti-Semitism task force in the counter-terrorism unit of the AFP. That's a fantastic thing to do. Coming and visiting the synagogue, that's a great thing to do. He's talking to Jewish leaders. But it just seems to be always just a little bit late. He seems to be doing it on the back foot instead of on the front foot. And therefore, even when he does the right thing, he doesn't get the credit for it because people are saying, oh, it's too late. Is that fair?
And Joe, that's the challenge in government, right? Because you're actually, there are very, very few occasions when you are responding to something that is unprecedented.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a shameful history in this country of attacks on Jewish sites. Synagogues go over 30, 40, 50 years. Now, in this government's case, they've changed, they've brought in harsher laws, they've made things an offense, doing a Nazi salute, all that sort of stuff. I mean, they've changed those laws. They've sent some pretty clear, consistent signals that this sort of outrageous stuff should not be tolerated. But then you get into the pressure cooker situation where one thing happens and then another thing happens and it starts to spiral. And it's trying to keep all of those things in the air. I remember probably one of the most challenging days I worked for Julia Gillard. You look at Julia now, she is revered, as she should be.
Right, yeah.
And people only are starting to appreciate what she had to go through. And the way she was treated, honestly, it was not fair. There was, there's no room for fairness in politics. That's the other thing you sort of learn quickly, right?
That's right. And you talk about the need to be able to bring people together, which is hard enough at the best of times, let alone in times of crisis like this, both an economic crisis and a social crisis. I had a look and my suspicions were confirmed as soon as Anthony Albanese did say he was going to the synagogue and he'd show up and everything. And so, of course, he gets heckled at the synagogue, which I think is a bit mean-spirited. I don't like that sort of stuff. I didn't like it when it happened to Scott Morrison or anyone else, and I don't like it when it happens to Anthony Albanese. But also, the minute that happened, he's got the Jewish community saying too little too late, where were you when we needed you? But instantly, you have crazy left-wing activists and elements of the Muslim community as well, not most, I don't think, but some, who are saying, oh, well, now you're going to the synagogue. Oh, you care all about anti-Semitism. What about us? We're getting killed by the tens of thousands. Oh, this Muslim bus was firebombed, in Adelaide, but, you never went to that school or you never... And so as soon as he does anything for one side, he's immediately attacked by the other. Firstly, do you think... You do crisis management. This is clearly, I think, a crisis of some kind or another. How would you advise the PM to navigate his way through it and hopefully, if possible, turn it around so that crisis goes away, is managed, and he then is able to go on and win the next election? Do you think that is a going concern? Do you think, firstly, that he can manage to turn it around and win the next election?
Well, I think in the last 24 hours, he's actually made it very, very clear. I mean, that he's been very clear about his intentions, and I think the point you're making is exactly it. It is a difficult judgment call to make sometimes. Like, when do you insert yourself, right? How do you respond? Are you, putting other things at risk? And that is a huge challenge. So that's exactly right, Joe. Can he turn it around? Well, look, his government have done a lot of great things. They're still doing good things now. He's announced, 3 years childcare. Yep. He's going to get rid of that test. And that's an amazing thing.
Is that the best strategy, to just change the subject and try and say, look, this is bad, I know, but look at all this good stuff? Or do you still have to fix the biggest problem? I mean, he's got to find a way to manage.
Well, he's doing both. I mean, he's been, I think he can now see that, it's more than the right time to make sure that he is, seen and his government is seen. I mean, every minister's been up. I mean, the truth is, my understanding is there was a senior cabinet minister there anyway in Melbourne, very early that morning. Other MPs showed up. So, but it's a case of making sure everybody is on song and coordinating. Governments are huge. They deal with multiple issues. Things are in the planning for months. It can be hard too to shift an announcement where they've gone through a whole productivity commission review. There's money set aside. You can just imagine, right? I mean, trying to turn that Titanic around, and then everyone who's geared up to be there on the day.
So you have to announce the childcare stuff no matter what else is going on.
100%. And sometimes it doesn't always cut through as much as you'd like it to. I mean, governments do more than one thing at once. Your audience can only take in one message at once. And that's a perennial frustration. As a former press sec, that was always frustrating to me. But that's the way it is. So there's a reason why governments, when they operate, they try to focus on one issue, that they want proactive, positive announcement of the day, and the rest of it is defense, And then something like this is appalling stuff happens, and it just takes you out into a different path altogether. So you've got to find a way back. You need to deal with that problem. And I think it's clear when you see his column today in the newspaper, everything he said, it doesn't hurt to remind people, actually, they have been mischaracterized, and I think quite unfairly at times, So just to remind people of their, more recent track record. So, and they are doing that.
What would your advice be to the PM? What do you think he needs to do from now until the next election?
Well, I mean, he's a guy. He doesn't need my advice. I can tell you that, Joe. But look, they need to, which is what they are doing, just get back to the things that actually resonate, which is, I've got your back. And how have you got my back? I've got your back because I'm going to make sure your family's got access to childcare, that you've got a proper tax cut, that you can get a job, that your children, at least, trying to do stuff around housing. That's what you have to do. Whereas, and then compare and contrast with the other guys, they still have nothing. I mean, I think that's fascinating too.
So politics is just much messier, more chaotic, more risk prone, so many more platforms to screw up on. And that's why I suppose we're seeing such a collapse in faith in the major parties generally, in institutions generally.
Look,
we all just go to hell in a handbasket.
You got it. That's exactly where we're going, Joe.
Master of the Dark Arts, Eamonn Fitzpatrick, thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story.
My pleasure, Joe. Always great to be with you.
And that is all we have time for this week. I hope it hasn't been too depressing, too profound. I am pretty profound. Can't help it. I am also pretty depressing. Just ask my wife. That's all we have time for this week. If you like what you hear, give us a rating, give us a review on whatever app or device or however it is you get these things. If you want us to talk about anything, got any feedback, any questions, just email therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can hit me up on Instagram. I'm on @Joe_Hildebrand. You can slide into my DMs. I don't know why Instagram is the only thing I'm on. I just got sick of all the others and I thought, damn, I'm just too good looking to give this one away. I'm just giving the housewives of Australia what they need. And of course, if you'd like to read more of what I have to say, you can always find me in the Daily Telegraph and other news mastheads around the country every Monday and Saturday. And until next week, bye-bye.